right, so why don't we get started now, and hopefully a couple other people will tune in as we go. So I know we have a couple people out there, so thanks for tuning in. We're three med school coach tutors. My name is Peter White. I'm a fourth year from Mecham, going into orthopedic surgery. You guys want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Dave. I'm a fourth year. I go to ASCOM, Midwestern Arizona. I'm going into internal medicine.
I'm Muneeb Shah. I'm a second year resident in radiology right now, reapplied in the match, and I'll be starting dermatology next year. So,
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to, there's a way you can type them in. We'll address anything that we can as we go. And if not, we'll, once we get through all of this, we'll address anything else. All right. So first off, why don't we get a little poll just to go, we can gauge our audience a little bit. You should be able to answer that. So what year of medical school are you in? Are you ones, twos? Are you somewhere in between? All right, so we've got one MS1. And all right. Yeah, so we'll basically tailor it to you as we're waiting for everyone else. Okay. So this is basically the plan. We're going to talk about the importance of boards, what the actual test is like, then go through setting up a schedule, how to select resources, the use of question banks, and a little bit about how MedSchoolCoach, the company that we're affiliated with, can be helpful. So what's the goal of boards? Why do we care? It's probably one of the most important factors to get into residency. When you actually look at all of the different variables, there's personal statements, dean's letters, letters of recommendations, honors and awards, research and publications. All of these things get placed in this very long ERAS application, and they're all very important. But one of the key things is when program directors are sorting through these applications, they need to basically filter them. And of all of these different things, the only one that's actually filterable is your board score. So that's basically used as a cutoff. Here's an example of one that you can see. It's one of the easiest things they can do. So that's what they're going to do to screen, and especially with this whole merger that's going on, it's really important to emphasize that you need to do well because the spots are dwindling and it's becoming a little chaotic. So a little bit of a literature review on board scores. When you're actually talking about and getting to that place, you need to actually look at what specialty you want to go into and location, both which, not surprisingly, have been correlated with higher board scores. As I mentioned, the cutoffs are real, and it's something you got to pay attention to. One of the things that's happened recently is that the American Medical Association has just recognized that the COMLEX and USMLE are to be equals. And that's based on a couple of studies that have come out that have shown that COMLEX scores and USMLE scores generally correlate. But one of the things, if you go back in the last few years, what they've shown is all of these USMLE program directors have tried to come up with formulas to try and interpret COMLEX scores because they have no idea what they're looking at. And all of the formulas that they've come up with just don't work. So really the goal has to be to do as well as possible on boards, not only the COMLEX, but also the USMLE. A lot of the schools like Rocky Mountain Vista is actually requiring their incoming classes to take the USMLE. So if you're in a position where you're sitting pretty, you should be kind of looking into taking both. So the COMLEX itself, it's basically a test of a very long day with 8 one-hour blocks, each one taking about 50 questions. So in total, it's about 400 questions. Once you get through 50, you can then move on to the next one. During the day, you get a few breaks. You get two 10-minute breaks in between the second and sixth sections. And then you get a 40-minute lunch break. And you should definitely take all of those just to kind of, for your own sanity, because it is such a long day. The COMLEX has a great blueprint for what they actually test. About 70 to 85% is actually based on the quote unquote, from their blueprint, scientific understanding of disease mechanisms. What this means is that you should really be prepared for, when you're studying, asking yourself the whys. the pathophysiology, the mechanism of actions, because that's what all of the questions are going to be. You get about a minute or 1.2 minutes per question, and you need to answer every single one of them. Don't skip them. No, there's no penalties for guessing. The USMLE is a little bit different. It's less questions. It's 7 one-hour blocks that are 280 questions. You get a little bit more time per question. You get about a minute and a half, and it's the same basic format. There are some important differences when it comes to the two different tests. I think we can all attest that the COMLEX is a little bit more vague and ambiguous and causes you to have a little bit more of a direct knowledge, whereas the USMLE requires you to be able to, it's more of a thinking test where you're able to kind of rule answers in and out and kind of get through it that way. So when we talk about studying, David's going to go and talk about setting up a study schedule.
Yeah. All right, let's go. So first of all, the first step obviously is to kind of set a date for the test. Depending on your curriculum, it's usually going to be within about 4 to 5 weeks after your end of the second year. I know some of you probably have an accelerated curriculum, so you end a little bit earlier. Some of you, like my school, ended in May. But generally, most schools have about 4 to 5 weeks of dedicated study times. That's usually when most students will schedule the exam. As far as kind of the semantics of scheduling both exams, the websites are pretty user-friendly. There are usually a lot of locations. The only piece of advice I have for that is to choose, do your research on the locations around you. Try to find one that's like the least amount of driving distance, and try to think of traffic, because most exams start at 7 or 8 in the morning. And the last thing you want to do is to go into the exam day having to worry about traffic and getting there late and possibly having that impinge on the time you have for the exam. As far as when to take both, so I'd imagine a lot of you are probably in this category where you have to take both exams. We generally recommend, at least myself, that you take the USMLE first. The reason being because COMLEX obviously has additional questions on OMM. And generally, I would probably leave about 4 to 7 days in between. I personally left 7, and I thought that was way too much. I was kind of just waiting, biding time, because by the time you're ready to take the first exam, you're pretty much ready for the second one. And so don't leave a big gap in between. And then really the time in between the exams, there's not a lot of new time to learn new material, but just focus on OMM, making that a strength. That is a large part of the COMLEX. And then also just touch up on weak topics you didn't feel comfortable with USMLE. So once you schedule the exam, then it's a pretty daunting task. How do you set up a study schedule? The first thing before I even dive into how to set up a schedule, I really wanted to emphasize the importance of not ignoring the classes that you're currently in. There was a pretty interesting study through the Osteopathic Association where they looked at some students that took the level 1 COMLEX, and they looked back, took a survey, and they ranked what materials and what things were most important. And they found a correlation between their GPA in their first year and in their first 2 years, as well as the amount of time they give themselves to prepare. So there's definitely something worth saying, that you should leave yourself a good amount of time to study and also still focus on the classes, because what's going to be on your exam is what you're learning in classes right now. Start small. It can be pretty daunting to work in studying for the boards into your daily schedule. I know a lot of us have pretty heavy curriculums. Exams take a lot of time. So just set a goal, I'm going to start with 30 minutes a day, maybe more on the weekends, and then you can gradually increase. And you'll find ways to kind of back off from studying for classes and to kind of integrate it into better studying for boards. And finally, this is pretty common, but if you haven't started, I'd recommend to annotate first aid along with your current curriculum. That way you're getting a lot of your class notes in there. So once setting up your actual study schedule, a good way to go about it is to choose the exam date. If you're not ready to schedule the exact date, just get kind of a reference of where you're at, and then calculate the number of weeks that you have up into the exam. And then it kind of comes down to choosing which resources you're going to focus on. Obviously, we recommend using first aid. That's pretty standard, especially for USMLE. Also looking at the question banks, and then you can use either Excel worksheet or Google Calendar, and pretty much just look at those resources and divide it up by chapters or page numbers into how many weeks for the exam. If you need help with this, we're great resources. We've done it with numerous students. We're here to help with that. This is kind of a very, very rough schedule that I made for one student. Basically, it just breaks down the first aid and UWorld. Basically, I had him start each week. He would go through these pages in first aid, and then he would go to the UWorld subjects and integrate those subjects so that he was basically covering the same stuff in UWorld that way. So just as a summary of kind of the stuff I covered, if you're taking both exams, definitely take USMLE first, leave about 4 to 7 days in between. Remember that study, focus on your preclinical courses, do well in those, and then you'll have less worries and pains to go through during your dedicated time. Annotate along first aid with your classes. And if you need help making a daily schedule, we're here to help.
All right, now I'm going to jump into what resources. So the gold standard, COMLEX, USMLE, is first aid. There's no doubt about it. You should be using it. You should be loving it, memorizing it. Really, it needs to be your gold standard. From there, you need to kind of choose, and I say this cautiously, choose limited resources that you know are going to be beneficial for your weak subjects. So especially as you're an MS1, early MS2, you should be kind of experimenting with different resources and figuring out what works for you, because that's going to be kind of the most important thing. When you get to your dedicated study time, you don't want to be, changing what you're doing. You want to be all set in your ability to do it. So there's a multitude of different resources out there. Here are just a list of some. They all have their pluses and minuses. The Golion Rapid Review Path I found to be one of the most beneficial because I found it integrated phys with the path, which is something that I was weak on. Farm is a lot of memorization. A lot of people like sketchy, people like the laying flashcards. You need to figure out what kind of learner you are early on in your studies so you can figure this out. And then there's a couple other options in there too. When it comes to question banks, there's, just like first aid is the gold standard for content review, when it talks about a question bank, the answer is UWorld. It is, for both tests, it is the best way to learn the medicine and the material that you need to know. Muneeb will talk a little bit more specifically about the nuanced differences, but when you use UWorld efficiently as a textbook, it is probably on par, if not the same as first aid, is that integral to your studies. For COMLEX specific banks, there's a bunch as well. There's ComBank, ComQuest, Firecracker. I know a lot of different schools out there do give access to it. They all have different values and are probably not as integral to doing well as, say, UWorld. But they do have their benefits in terms of having OMM questions and stuff like that, which you need to get through. When it comes to the OMM specific material, the gold standard for that is the Savarese, or the Green Book as some people call it. I absolutely agree with what Dave was talking about in terms of setting it up with the USMLE first and then the COMLEX a few days later, and then just powering through this book. And then also at the same time using a COMLEX specific bank to do OMM and kind of the ethics questions, because that's the kind of big things that are going to show up. And out of all the material, the thing that you must know the best is the sympathetics, parasympathetics, and probably some of the Chapman's points as well, because those are what the questions are, simply. And they can help you, especially on some of the path questions, kind of getting into the right organ system or right organ. So big things. First aid, UWorld, and Savarese. Those are going to be your gold standard. Start early with experimenting with what works and what doesn't, and don't get overwhelmed. So many students just get using too many resources. Figure out what works for you early. All right, Muneeb.
All right, like I said, I'm Neeb. I'm going to talk mostly about question banks. I think someone logged in that is studying for COMLEX 2. So I will do a little bit of talking about it just because it's in the same line. It's just we use a little bit of different resources. All right, so USMLE RX. This isn't a COMLEX 2 product, but this is something for COMLEX 1 and Step 1. It's something to use early on, so I'm glad that there's a first-year med student here because it may be too late for a second-year med student to start integrating USMLE RX into their studying. The questions are not nearly as high quality as UWorld are, but they basically what they do is the way that the questions are written, you'll get the answer explanation, and in the answer explanation, they'll screenshot you a picture of first aid, the page that question came from. And what that does is just constantly reinforce first aid to you, which I think is like everyone was saying, is one of the most important resources that you can reinforce. So instead of going to an outside resource and using something like Kaplan, which I know a lot of people like, that's introducing new study material. And I think that it's really important to master certain material instead of spreading yourself too thin. So USMLE-RX is a great way to reinforce first aid. And if you do it subject-wise, so during your classes, when you're in cardiology and your second year of med school and you're going through cardiology, you don't want to study reproductive endocrinology. You know, you're just going to be spreading yourself way too thin. So if you're doing subject-wise USMLE-RX block with your cardiology block in med school, what you're going to end up doing is mastering cardiology. You'll do well on your classes, which you don't want to blow off, and you'll also be prepared for that section on boards. So I'm really a big fan of just reinforcing the same subjects that you're doing in class, and USMLE-RX is a great way to do that. So UWorld, gold standard of QBanks. I think that anybody that's not doing UWorld is doing themselves a huge disservice. I've spoken to a lot of students that are DO students as well, and they will blow off UWorld in favor of QBanks like ComQuest and ComBank. I think that's a huge mistake. UWorld has tremendously good explanations, and it will actually train you to be a good doctor. And that's what these tests, it seems like they're testing you on this minutia. When is it ever going to be relevant? But these questions are aimed to get you ready to be a doctor. And so the UWorld questions are written extremely well. They'll train you to answer questions well on COMLEX. And this applies for COMLEX 2 as well. I think for COMLEX 2, it becomes even more important resource because there's not a good standardized book. So for COMLEX 2, there's not like a first aid anymore. So this becomes both the QBank and the first aid for COMLEX 2. For COMLEX 1 specifically, I think that do this first, and then if you have extra time, you can do the ComQuest and ComBank questions. But UWorld, I think, is going to be your #1 resource. Spend a lot of time reviewing the questions. Don't just do them to do them. They will help you become a better test taker, which is extremely important. But the question explanations have so much in them that will apply to you on test day. And everything is very up to date. Whereas like first aid will be a year behind. UWorld will change while you're taking the test. They'll add new questions. I remember when I was taking my step 1, I went into the test, right a couple days before the test, I had finished UWorld. And I had no questions left. And then 2 new questions popped up in my QBank. And I was like, oh, I guess 2 new questions they just wrote. I should do them before I go on my test. And I went into my test the next day, and one of those questions was almost verbatim on my test. So it's so up to date that you really want to stay on top of it because they're staying on top of what the most current literature is and what they're testing on the USMLE. So don't blow this QBank off. If you get anything from this talk, make sure you do UWorld and you spend a lot of time doing it. So that, like I mentioned, ComBank, ComQuest, those are like the 2 competing QBanks for COMLEX specific material. They do have these like factoids that they test you on COMLEX, like, side effect of metronidazole is a metallic taste in your mouth. Like you'll get questions like that correct on COMLEX because they just are buzzwords that are in ComQuest. But I think at the end of the day, the explanations are decent. The questions are pretty well written. I would focus mostly on using it for OMM material, like just do the OMM questions. If you have more time, you can do the rest of the QBank, but I would also use it along with Stavridis, which I think is the best review book for the COMLEX. All right, and so when you do any question bank, all of these question banks will give you a score report at the end, and it will tell you how you did in certain sections, how you did in physiology, how did you do in pharmacology, and you can use that because it will tell you based on everybody else in the country that's also using this QBank where you fall on that spectrum, and you'll be able to say, okay, I'm a little bit weak in pharmacology, maybe I should spend more time reviewing pharmacology, and you go back to sketchy pharm and you do those things as well. So I think that it's good. It's valuable to try and figure out where you're weak. I think that becomes one of the most important things when you're going over question banks, is not to just do these things passively. You really have to say, what am I weak at? Do I not know a lot of facts? Is my memory bad? Or is it I just don't understand certain concepts? I think you need to be really active and take control of your studying. I think this applies on step 1 and step 2. All right, so like I said, I think I just talked about this, how to use it, focus on your weakest subjects in the report. And I think the more questions you do, the more accurate report becomes. If you've done 80 questions in the QBank, it becomes very limited utility. But once you're halfway through, it really will give you a good idea of where you are weak, and you can focus on those things. Self-assessment, this applies for both step 1 and step 2. I think the NBME, no doubt, this for USMLE becomes the best predictor. And I honestly think that all of you should sit for the USMLE. There are still DO program directors that have ACGME accredited programs that will look at the COMLEX equally. There's a lot of ACGME programs that will look at COMLEX equally. But I think that if you're capable of sitting for the USMLE, you should sit for it, because the test is way more standardized. Like if you took it 2 days in a row, you would probably get close to the same score. I really honestly can't say that for the COMLEX, and I think your points will swing. I don't know if everyone else agrees with me on that, but I think depending on when you take it, your score may switch about 50 points to 100 points with that. I think it's a little bit ridiculous. I think the USMLE is pretty good as far as being the least precise. So right now there's a couple forms out. They're actually going to add new forms and get rid of old forms. So if you want to use 13, 15, or 16, I would buy them now before they expire, because they still are excellent predictors of how you'll do on the test. For example, like if you take the NBME practice test 17 and you go and take the test in a week, whatever you got on that test is going to be what you score within 5 points. That's how standardized these questions are as predictors. As far as UWorld, also for step 1 and step 2 has practice tests. The questions are very good. They're very similar to the real test. The real test has monster stems. Sometimes you'll have to scroll down. They're so long on the test. But on all these practice exams, they're much shorter. But UWorld is more accurate in how the test will look than the NBME. But the NBME is a better predictor of how you'll actually perform on the test. So there's also the ComSAGs forms, and these exist for both COMLEX 1 and COMLEX 2. I only used one form, and I felt that it didn't predict well where anyone was. I would have friends that would take 2 forms week back to back, and they would score within 200-point variations. So I find that that's probably not a great predictor. It will give you an idea of what the COMLEX questions will look like. And I think the more practice tests you do, the better you are off. So it's worth it to take at least one ComSAG form, but I wouldn't rely on it as something to use consistently. So my take-home points, UWorld, like I said, the best resource for step 1 and step 2 as far as question banks go. Spend a lot of time reviewing those. Annotate UWorld facts into first aid. If you use Anki, if you're familiar with Anki, put notes into flashcards. You want to be reviewing UWorld consistently, because those questions will show up on your test day. And this will apply for USMLE 1, USMLE 2, COMLEX 1, and COMLEX 2. Do not blow it off. For ComQuest and ComBank, like I said, use it to review OMM questions. And NBME is the best predictor for USMLE score. UWorld questions are very similar to the real exam. And I think that test taking skills alone, if you were to learn nothing else, within your dedicated time period. So you have 5 weeks to study for boards, and you didn't learn a single new fact. if you just got better at answering questions, your score would go up significantly. And so when I'm working with my students at Med School Coach, I talk a lot about test taking skills. Why did you get that wrong? And how can we make it so you don't answer that question wrong again? Because when you go into that test, you're never going to know all the facts. And so your goal while you're studying is to know 70% of the facts and still be able to answer 100% of the questions. So that's why you need to really improve your test taking skills. You need to be able to say, that's not the right answer. I'm not going to choose that. I can, what is this question asking me? And really actively ask yourself, what is this question asking me? What were they looking for? Because somebody wrote that question and they were trying to test you on a certain concept. And so they're actually going for something. So if you really think about and try to analyze these questions, which I do with a lot of students, I think that you can really improve your score. And that's a key to doing well on the COMLEX or USMLE.
So I think Muneeb pretty much just covered this, but how does one-on-one tutoring kind of fit into somebody's study prep? It really is, exactly what he just said. People have different problems all throughout kind of the spectrum of studying, whether or not it's setting a study schedule, they're just not, set on key concepts, they have trouble doing questions, but principally you need somebody to kind of help guide you through the process. And it really helps to have somebody who's done it before. And that because they can help to individualize your studying to really help, whether or not it's apply, build on foundational concepts, or even just help kind of use repetition to help drill these facts into you. So at Med School Coach, that's basically kind of how we go about it. We personalize, we use great teachers, we work on quick learning, focus on you, which is kind of probably the biggest thing. We look at people's individual weaknesses, whether or not it's their score reports, self-assessments, or even just talking through them, and we're able to help identify those key problems that you might have an inherent bias and not be able to identify yourself. So that's basically what we do. We have a satisfaction guarantee, and we basically have a score increase guarantee, which you can kind of look, they're both on the website as well. So thank you guys for coming out. We're gonna be around to answer any questions. Maybe we wanna, because I know Vincent was here talking about COMLEX level 2, do we want to quickly run down and kind of give our thoughts on that test? Dave, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as far as COMLEX level 2, I completely agree with what Muneeb said. The best resource is USMLE or UWorld. There's no standardized like first aid text that you can really refer to. Do well on your, depending on where you are at for your studying, do well on your shelf exams. Try to study throughout the entire block. If you learn the material well the first time, and if you perform well in your shelves, you'll have such an easier time. Like, you don't need a full 5 weeks in order to study for the exam. And then I think probably the highest thing I can tell you, the most important, is use Savarese again. Go through it a week before. The same exact questions that were on level 1 will be on level 2. Doesn't change at all. And it's a huge chunk of the exam. It's at least probably 20 to 25%.
Muneeb?
Yeah, I kind of want to mirror some of the things that David said. Savarese plays into step COMLEX 1, COMLEX 2, and COMLEX 3, unfortunately. Those same questions. It's not like it becomes more difficult or they change the way that they write questions once you get to level 2. It's basically the same exact thing. And so I would definitely focus on that. I would also go back and review some of first aid for step 1. Because this is all, like, the steps are written in such a way that they actually call them steps because they think that at each level you're building. They don't look at them as like separate like blocks. It's like this is supposed to be building. And so you'll actually see a lot of step 1 filter into step 2. And that's why it's so important to do well on step 1, because that knowledge will carry you forward probably through your whole career, believe it or not. I know it sounds ridiculous at this time, but that knowledge will come into play when you're on rounds in the hospital. It'll come into play when you're a resident. But I think that going back to review, specifically farm and micro from step 1 are some things that people neglect to do for step 2, which I think is really important. And UWorld, and there's a couple of other books like Master the Boards and Step Up to USMLE that are recommended. I found that a lot of it, the information was inaccurate, and I was spending too much time trying to figure out what was up to date and what wasn't. That I just focused on USMLE World, and I focused on, if I wasn't sure, like if I didn't understand a topic, I would use Up to Date, which is a very comprehensive resource. But if you look those things up and Up to Date, you're gonna be getting the most up to date information. Like I said, they're trying to test you on how to be a doctor. So choosing what a doctor would do in a particular question, like what are we going to treat this strep throat with, you would do what you would do in real life. So actually knowing how to do things for real on rounds, and as a third year student, I think that will actually help too.
Yeah, I mean, you guys both kind of hit the nail on the head. It's really, the biggest thing is, it starts from day one. You do well in your first 2 years, it sets you up perfectly for COMLEX level 1. You do well in COMLEX level 1 if you actually, the few papers in the osteopathic journals have said that the biggest correlation is for COMLEX 2 is doing well in COMLEX 1. So you really got to sit down from day one and really just start plugging away. In terms of the questions themselves, I know, having sat for step 2 and COMLEX 2, the questions, at least for me, I don't know if you guys would agree, they felt very much like taking one of the practice NBME questions, maybe a little bit longer of a stem, but more of just like a question of, you know it or you're not, which is very much different compared to the step, which is, it's a thinking test. Can you rule things out or apply information in ways that you have not seen it before? So being able to kind of knowing those, founding facts early is huge. And yeah, Savarese is huge for level 2. I remember, getting through the first 200 questions and being like, all right, that wasn't bad. And then just getting blown away by OMM and ethics. Ethics is another thing that comes up a lot on level 2, that you definitely, you probably don't get a lot of it, and maybe one course on it at most during your med school, but will get a lot of questions on it on level 2. And the random bugs, like the bioterrorism agents and stuff that you haven't even thought of since level 1. So it's definitely, definitely make sure to go back and look through it. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I think people can ask questions through the chat, or can they speak?
Through the chat. You should be able to. So why don't we run through what's our each one of us, what's our major take home point? Overall, level 1, what would you say?
For level 1, I would say that the best advice that I got when I was studying for level 1 and level 2, any test, is when you're confronted with any piece of information that you don't know at any point in your studying, learn it then, don't learn it later, because you may not have another chance to confront that. So say you get a biostats question and you're like, nah, I'm going to blow biostats off for another month. Well, that month is going to come and it's going to be close to test day. So my number one thing is, of course, the resources we talked about, find a good mentor, all these things. But the number one thing I would say is learn it today and master it. And then it will continue to build on that.
That was pretty much where I was going as well. I was going to say, really, when it comes down to it, especially, we're still a little bit ways out where you're probably still learning and mastering the material. But when it comes down to dedicated, it's not about learning the material better, it's learning how to take the test. Really target your weaknesses. That's, a lot of students come to me and ask, how can I raise my score 10, 20 points? And it always comes down to looking at your score reports, going to those areas. Don't spend time on things that spend time on things you don't know. That's the best piece of advice I can give.
Yeah, I remember the best advice that I was given before going to medical school, which was basically to buy the most comfortable chair possible and sit in it until your rear hurts. And I think no other time speaks to that more than your dedicated study period, where you need to really go all in and put as much effort into studying as you can. Set up those 14-hour study days, figure out ways to get the questions done. Coming up with a balanced study schedule where you're getting content review, but also applying questions or doing questions and applying the material is huge. And making sure that you're using resources efficiently. I can't tell you how many students that I've worked with who will go through UWorld and will either just not think about the wrong answers or not read the answers. UWorld is a textbook. And when you have a question and you're going through it, you should be asking yourself, ruling things in and out and saying, why is this correct? Why is this not? And then checking your thought process with the answers, because that's how you know whether or not you actually know the material or not. And that's reflected on your score reports. So I think the big thing is, get to studying simply. And yeah, and we're here to help if you need us. All right, guys, thanks for coming out. Thanks for listening.